Hi, this is Dr. Graves back with part two of the economic geography lecture. We already covered the primary industries, and now we're going to focus on secondary industries. Basically, this is manufacturing, sometimes processing. As I mentioned before, that this secondary industry is oftentimes attracted by the presence of a primary industry. So if there's some kind of extractive thing going on, you're pulling coal or iron or oil or even corn out of the ground, oftentimes it makes sense for the manufacturing or the processing of that to take place very close to the extractive industries to that point in order to minimize transportation costs between the two locations. Manufacturing is great to have around your hometown or wherever you are because manufacturing adds a lot of use value to the extracted industry. So you think about oil, and crude oil doesn't have a great deal of use value. You can't use it for a lot of things, but if you manufacture it into gasoline, then gasoline has a great deal of use value. Think about the difference in cost between a barrel of oil, which I think right now is at something like $70 a barrel, and that's at 55 gallons. And you think, what would it cost me to put 55 gallons of fuel into my car at $3.50? And it's a great deal more than 75 bucks. So that is the value added by manufacturing. And of course, that's a lot of money, and it goes traditionally into the hands of workers, people that worked in a factory like this. This is just a old school vertical factory near Troy, New York that I snapped off the freeway years ago. People that worked in these kind of industries tended to make good money with reasonable amounts of benefits and days off, that sort of thing. And so these are the sort of gold standard of jobs for the working class. The family that I grew up in, my father worked in a factory like this, had an eighth grade education, but nevertheless got a job right out of high school at one factory and parlayed that into a better paying job at a nearby factory. And though he had a limited education, he could weld, and that was something that the factory itself trained him to do. And in the mid 70s, when I was a kid, he was making really good money, enough to support the family, buy a house, cars, go on vacation. We weren't rich by any means, but many of the people whose dads or moms worked at that factory were able to support the entire family on just that wage, and the other spouse didn't have to go to work. My family had way too many kids, and so my mom also worked. But if you only had maybe two kids, it's probably more than enough money to support sort of the lower middle class, working class dream of owning a home and having some comfort. Still had to go to work every week, but you didn't really live paycheck to paycheck, as they said. Do we have local examples of this? Sure. Los Angeles is one of the great manufacturing centers in the world, certainly in the United States. We think of Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago and Pittsburgh being these manufacturing places, but Los Angeles takes a back seat to nobody on that. Some of the things that you would find here close to our university. Here's Aerojet Rocketdyne. manufacturers of high-tech space and aircraft equipment, Moog organs just down the street from campus as well. The entire Chatsworth area is heavy with manufacturing. The East Valley over along the railroad corridor and San Fernando area, also heavy manufacturing. So we have super high-tech things like Aerodyne or Aerojet Rocketdyne, and very low-tech stuff here. This is a picture I took of American Apparel, which is low-end textiling work that goes on downtown. Notice that there's a Legalize LA banner across this because of this low wage work is attractive to a number of undocumented folks that live around here. And this one says immigration reform now. These factories, I think, are now shut down, not because of the immigration issues, but because of some hijinks of the guy who was running the whole thing, the owner of it. Another major manufacturing thing is oil refining here in Southern California. And so certainly you've seen this factory if you've driven down the 405 towards Long Beach. You probably smelled it for sure, even if you weren't looking over there. So why of where is our question all the time in this course. And so why do factories set up where they do? And so I've got a picture of an old factory in New England here, and this is the cradle of American industrialism up in New England, and we'll talk about that. The traditional factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Capital is, you could think of it mostly as investment money to start the business, but there are also human capital factors that are sort of hard to keep separate from labor. But so we'll think of this in this class as capital as investment money. If you get really good at economic geography, maybe you could go into industrial site location analysis, which is an extremely lucrative career field in which you get to make really big decisions about where to put a factory. And I had an old professor that did some of that, and I'm sure he made far more money off of doing industrial site location than he did off of teaching classes. So some of the things we want to keep in mind is when you look for a place to put a new factory, or any kind of industry for that matter, is how much does labor cost? You would like to keep that as low as possible, and you would like to have the labor skill as high as possible. But a lot of times you can't do both at one time. You have to have a certain level of skill in order to run any kind of business. So factory owners or business owners hope to balance that as best they can. A lot of times the labor cost is a factor of the cost of living. If you've got a lot of high-skilled people, that drives up labor costs, which also drives up the cost of living. And given that you are mostly Californians, you certainly know about the cost of living in the San Francisco Bay Area down towards San Jose, Silicon Valley. What do they have? Extremely high skilled labor, which drives the cost of labor up, which in turn sets off a great deal of competition for living spaces, for property, and that then winds up creating a sort of self-reinforcing loop of increasing labor cost, increasing cost of living, etc. Other industries don't work that way. Those are called footloose industries, and these are footloose industries are ones that generally don't have a lot of fixed capital, like a huge factory that can't be moved. Those are ones that will up and move at the drop of a hat, looking generally for low-cost labor. The classic example of that is actually pictured here, and this is textiling. So textiling is basically anything that's involved in the manufacture of clothing or soft goods like towels, underwear, pillowcases, and that kind of stuff. New England was where textiling began in the United States. It was essentially the first industry in the United States, the making of clothing and other kinds of bed sheets and towels and whatnot. And it's also the first thing that up and moved for a cheaper location. We'll talk about that at a little bit greater length here in the upcoming slides. The places that first had manufacturing in the United States of textiles were all along what are called today fall line cities. These are places where there is or was a waterfall, oftentimes enhanced by the locals so that they make a dam, and this is a waterfall at a fall line city in Keachie Gorge, Vermont, and then behind here is the Mill Pond. Here's another one in Ohio. Here's the falls, not nearly as steep as what you would find in much of New England. And here's the Mill Pond behind it, and over this goes the water. And normally what you would have is a water wheel here that was driving a lot of gears and machinery in the factory. This is before the age of electricity or before the age of steam power. So here's yet another mill situation where you would have had the water going over and a big water wheel here being driven by the water to drive whatever activity was going on in this factory. So the power source was water. Once steam power is invented and perfected in the 1830s, then these places like New England have no location advantage over other places with cheaper labor, say the Carolinas. Mill girls were the cheapest possible labor back in the day up in New England, and so they were our first factory workers. But they eventually, there was a shortage of labor, which drove up the cost of mill girls or mill workers in New England. And so when steam power was replacing water power, then those places that had expensive labor, also distant from the cotton fields of the South, suddenly were competitively disadvantaged, and all the mills left New England for the Carolinas. Where are the textile factories today? Well, many of them are in overseas now. Very few of them are left in the Carolinas, and free trade, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, drove a good bit of textiling originally across the border into Mexico, but then Mexico has been outcompeted against even lower cost locations like China, increasingly India, Bangladesh, and other places with even less labor costs. It looks like I'm at the 15-minute limit for this part of the lecture, so I'm going to stop this video here, and we'll pick up manufacturing in part 3.